This videotape is about John Brown Campbell and his 10 children and his grandchildren. J.B. Campbell was the son of James Campbell, Jr., who in turn was the son of James Campbell, Sr. He was in all likelihood third or fourth generation Scotch-Irish. These Ulster Scotsmen had emigrated in substantial numbers from Ireland to New Hampshire between 1730 and 1760. James Murray, author of Londonderry Airs, states these Ulster Scotsmen were greatly insulted when labeled Irish. They were drawn north to Nova Scotia in the 1760s by generous land grants and a new military stability created by the expulsion of the Acadians, the pacification of the Micmac Indians, and in 1760 the defeat of New France, a hitherto threat to English colonial expansion in Nova Scotia. Our forefather, possibly James Sr., was granted land in the Londonderry district, now in Colchester County, on the north shore of the Cobequid Basin, which lies at the east end of the Minas Basin. John Brown Campbell, born September 30th, 1844, was the seventh child of James Campbell and Mercy Webb. Little is recorded of J.B.'s early life until at age 22, on March 9, 1868, he married Mary Jane Wilson. A year and a half later, a son, Franklin Edgar, was born. Tragically, Mary Jane died 1 month after her son's birth. J.B. purchased the Montrose property in August 1870, 5 months prior to remarrying. His second wife was 21-year-old Margaret Dickey. She obtained an instant family, a husband and his year-old child, and soon her father-in-law, James Campbell, also moved in. From 1871 to 1890, Maggie gave birth to 9 children. In 1871, John Leander Austin, known as Austin, was born. In 1873, William True. 1875, Frederick, or Fred. 1877, Agnes, or Aggie. 1879, Janie. 1882, Norman Garfield. 1883, Margaret Amelia, or Millie. 1885, Ella Blanche. And last, in 1890, Bernard Ness. Franklin Edgar Campbell, better known as Ed, J.B.'s oldest son from his first marriage, left the nest at an early age and sought his fortune south of the border in New Hampshire. J.B.'s brother, Thomas, lived in that area. Ed married Lizzie Bernardi in the summer of 1901. They had no children. Ed eked out a living on a small subsistence farm in Nashua, New Hampshire, at times requiring assistance from his Nova Scotian relatives. The last known correspondence received from Ed was in June of 1944. The ledger of J.B. Campbell in the early 1890s indicates that he was logging and operating a portable mill in Portapique, Bass River, Economy, and Castlereagh. Aggie's future husband, Ormel Simpson, was employed as a millwright and a sawyer. Without doubt, the older sons were working with their father. Pay deductions in the ledger for foodstuff, tobacco, kerosene oil, and clothing indicate the beginnings of the company store. In the summer of 1893, J.B. expanded his operation to the south shore of the Minas Basin. Payments were made for hauling the boiler to Shubenacadie, to Knoll, and to Tennecape. J.B. moved over the bay from the home place in Montrose to Walton, leaving Austin and his new bride, Eva Hamilton, the Montrose farm. In the next year, 94, Aggie married Ormel Simpson. The Registry of Deeds in Truro reveals that J.B. sold 14 properties in the early 90s in the Portapique region, but he also purchased 10 properties from 1901 to 1917 in the region, indicating that this shore continued to figure in the firm's overall plan. In 1896, Janie married Oscar Sterrett, who either was or was soon to become a ship's captain. In the same year, J.B. purchased land in the Windsor area. The ongoing search for favorable timber stands drew him further along the shore. This proved to be a fortuitous move, for in October of 1897, 2/3 of Windsor was decimated by fire. J.B. and his sons were positioned to capitalize on the high demand and improved price for their product. J.B. built a number of structures and provided lumber for many more in the town's reconstruction. A lumber warehouse, so large that it was later converted into the town's rink and hockey arena, was built. He constructed a large home on Pontic Road in 3 Mile Plains and lived there until 1900, when his 2 houses on Stannis Street were completed. The west half of the double house became the home place. Will, who had married Bertha Tomlinson in 1899, remained in the Pontic Road house. Shown is the single house on Stannis Street, built adjacent to the double house, and built on the same plan, only much smaller. In 1904, J.B. entered into partnership with Fred, his only unmarried son, interested in lumbering. Norman enrolled in Dalhousie College, having already chosen a career in the clergy. Millie taught school and made plans to attend King's College in Windsor.
Mount Denson, April 18, 1904. And now, Fred, I want your opinion on something. If I can save enough money this year, what do you think of my going to King's College for 2 years? Of course, if I can't save enough to pay my college expenses, I won't try. But I am in hopes that I can, and who knows when I shall ever have another chance, for we may not be in Windsor much longer, according to Papa. And of course, I couldn't go to college if I had to pay my board. At the end of those 2 years, I, of course, would teach again, and perhaps could save enough to finish at Dalhousie.
While at King's, she met her future husband, Ernest Spur. Ella married Charles Irving McNabb, a manual arts teacher, in December 1906. Millie married Ernest Spur 1 month later, in January of 07. Bernard followed his older brother Norman to Halifax in 1906 at the age of 16 to attend Dalhousie. The mix of Norman's religious and business background are illustrated in the following agreement between Norman and Bernard.
I hereby promise, God helping me, to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, including beer, wine, and cider as a beverage. I also promise that I will not use tobacco in any shape or form. Signature, Bernard Campbell. I, Norman G. Campbell, promise that I will give Bernard N. Campbell $50 when he is 21 years old if he keeps those promises above mentioned. The $50 are to bear interest from the present date until his 21st birthday, and, if he wishes, he may have $2 from the 50 at each successive birthday for 5 times only. Signature, Norman G. Campbell. This contract is to hold until BNC's 21st birthday.
Performing plays was one source of entertainment in the Campbell household on Stannis Street. Bernard, Norman, Millie, and Ella perform The Hold-Up. Bernard was diabetic. He became very ill in 1907 when he penned a number of poems.
Verses composed by Bernard Ness Campbell, Windsor, Nova Scotia. Many we know, but few are friends. If you have a friend, keep him, for a friend is more precious than gold. Jesus, take me, I am weary. Take my soul and let it rest, for it is sad and dreary. Take me to thy breast.
Bernard died on April the 21st, 1907. In the following year, 1908, both Janie and Norman boarded the train in Windsor and moved west to Calgary for health reasons.
Calgary, Alberta, February 6, 1908. But I mustn't forget to tell you what a wonderful effect that Calgary is having on us all. I felt wretchedly the first 5 or 6 weeks here, but I'm feeling splendidly these days. I was weighed last week, and just guess, I weighed 8 pounds more than I did the day I left Windsor. Now, don't you think that a pretty good beginning?
Late in 1908, Fred married Henrietta Wilson, Etty, and moved to Clarksville, which became the center of the firm's activity. J.B. in this period returned to the North Shore, to Highland Village, intent on establishing a large farm. He constructed a barn reputed to have been one of the largest structures on that shore. J.B. kept in constant correspondence with Fred, his junior partner. Logs were reaped from both sides of the bay, with Austin at times providing lumber and logs to meet the firm's orders. Meanwhile, in Clarksville, the firm constructed a large stationery mill with its own railway siding, a general store with a feed mill attached, and an ingenious tram line powered by a steam-driven donkey engine running on hardwood rails. They also contracted with the Dimmick Plaster Mill to haul gypsum on the tram line to the rail sidings in Riverside. In either late 1913 or 1914, Maggie, Mrs. Margaret Dickey Campbell, suffered a stroke, which left her paralyzed on one side. J.B. hired a tug to carry his wife in her bed to Aggie, her daughter's home in Carr's Brook. Margaret Dickey Campbell died in Carr's Brook 2 days after Christmas in 1915. 7 years later, the elderly gentleman joined his wife in the hereafter. J.B. had loved politics and was committed to the Liberal Party, and at one point had said that he was cursed with conservative sons-in-law. His obituary stated, "Mr. Campbell has been ailing for some years following an attack of flu, and after Mrs. Campbell's death has been principally with his son Fred at Clarksville, although in summer he delighted in going for a while over the bay, as Montrose or Portapique, Colchester County was called." The obituary continued, "The little Sunday school at Mapleton was still near his heart, and for years he devoted his life and service in instructing the young people there in the Sabbath school. His unbounded knowledge of the Scripture and the pleasing method of importing that knowledge will be remembered forever." Austin Campbell continued to live on the Montrose farm following the departure of the remainder of the family to Walton in 1893. There Eva gave birth to their 8 children. Austin farmed, logged, and manufactured lumber with his steam-powered portable sawmill. Austin, quiet and reserved, his chuckle was almost a soundless laugh. Typical of J.B.'s children, he was a strong supporter of the church and superintendent of the Sunday school. He was the undisputed head of his household, a characteristic he shared with his brothers. In 1925, Austin moved with his family to Clarksville, where he remained until he returned to Montrose in 1931. His son Reg remained in the Campbell home, raising his family there. Margaret P. was born around 1894. She taught school and in 1921 married Ben Lank at Montrose. They lived on the Montrose farm until moving to the Annapolis Valley in 1928. They made their permanent home in Kingston, Nova Scotia. Their two children were Edward and Louise. Harold, the second child, was born in 1896. He joined his father in the lumbering business. When Austin died in 1935, it was Harold who inherited the sawmill. By the 1930s, the land registry for Hants County reveals that Harold was purchasing timberland in that county. His successful lumbering enterprise was interrupted by World War II, so he and his wife Rita opened a grocery business in Halifax. After the war, he returned to lumbering and dabbled in the real estate market. Their children were Catherine, Keith, Eva, and Ruth. Austin's third child, Herman, joined the clergy. The typical Campbell tradition. Austin's family already had a teacher and a lumberman. In 1924, Herman graduated in theology from Pine Hill Divinity Hall. He served as a private during World War I in France and was decorated with the Military Medal for Bravery in the Field. In World War II, he served overseas as a director of the YWCA War Service. The Reverend Dr. Herman Campbell served in various parishes in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and in Toronto. Herman and Margaret had 4 children: Ishbel, Wendy, John, and Paul. These children are shown in this series of photographs. Austin and Eva's 4th child was Earl, born in 1900. He died in 1923. Neither a photograph nor a sample of his poetry was available at the time of production. The 5th child was Reginald, born in October 5, 1901. Reg had polio as a child. He went with his father to Clarksville in 1925 and ran the grocery store established by J.B. Campbell and Son. After the store burned, Reg built a new store further down the road. Later in life, he became a skilled electrician and diversified into television repair. Reg married in June of 1927. He and his wife had 3 children: Joyce, Ray, and Bernard, shown in this shot at Shorts Lake, entitled Campbell Cousins. Wendy, Ray, John standing in the background, and young Bernard in the front. Ruth, and Joyce. The 6th child and 7th child, Lloyd and Isabel, died as infants. Donald, Austin's youngest child, was born in August of 1910. He was the last of the Campbells to live in the Montrose home place. Don sold the property in 1946. Don and Gertrude have 1 child, Joan. Don and Gertrude presently reside in Bass River.
William True Campbell married in his 26th year to Bertha Tomlinson of Walton. In the next 13 years, Will and Bertha had 9 children. Vernon and John R., Kathleen and Florence. Jenny is just out of the scene to the right. Clarence and baby Helen. Neither Ted or Muriel were born when this photograph was taken. Will lived for a while in the Pawnick Road house built by J.B. in 3 Mile Plains until it burned in 1911. Bertha moved back to her mother's in Walton to give birth to her 7th child, Helen. The family then moved to Maitland, followed by Highland Village, where Ted was born in 1915. Shortly after this, the family settled permanently in the spacious Pembroke home, which was constructed originally for a sea captain. A stationery mill was constructed down from the house at the bottom of the hill. In the 1930s, Will's enterprising spirit could not be satisfied by lumbering alone. Living only 100 yards from the shore, he envisioned a profitable business carrying pulp down the bay to the newly established Minas Basin Pulp Mill in Hantsport. He purchased several vessels, including the locally famous retired river ferry, the Rotundus, to haul the pulp-laden scows. A barber shop, a store, and an ice cream parlor in Walton were owned by Will for a number of years. During the Second World War, he operated a dance hall in Stanley near the Air Force training base. My favorite Will story was told by his brother, Norman Garfield, when Norman was on the train platform in Windsor as a young man, ready to set out on his adventure to the Canadian West. Brother Will stepped forward, removed his own large fur coat from his back, and gave it to Norman to ward off the cold on his westward trek. Vernon, Will's oldest child, born in April 1900, moved to the United States, where he was employed as a building contractor. He died in 1932. John R., the second son, born in 1901, worked for a period in the Oxford Foundry and in the store at Clarksville. He later shipped out to Panama, where he worked for most of his life. Kathleen, the third child, went to Rhode Island to work. There she met her future husband, Jim McDonald. They were wed on June 17, 1931. They had no children, but when Kathleen's sister Florence died at the age of 26, she left a 3-month baby, Verna, who was raised by Jim and Kathleen. Florence married George Thorpe in December of 1925. She died 6 years later. Jenny, Will and Bertha's 6th child, married Jack McDonald, Kathleen's husband's brother. Clarence, born in 1906, operated the farm across the road from the Pembroke farm before moving to Dartmouth. In 1932, he married Winnie McNeil. Clarence passed away in December of last year. Helen, after completing her nurse's training, married the Reverend Robert Ross. Among the areas they resided were Marguerite, Cape Breton, Economy, and Chatham, New Brunswick. Helen now resides in Truro. Frederick B., or Ted as he was better known, went overseas during World War II. Pilot officer Ted Campbell married Dolores Glennis at the beginning of his second tour of duty on December 8, 1944. 15 days later, he was killed. Muriel, the youngest of Will's children, married Herbert Butler in 1943 and presently resides in Brampton, Ontario. Fred, J.B.'s third son and partner since 1904, moved to Clarksville in 2008 with his new bride, Eddie. It was in Clarksville that the firm had established its stationery mill. Fred oversaw the mill and logging in that proximity while J.B. ran his Highland Village farm. They corresponded frequently. Fred and Eddie had 7 children. Mar, Lillian, the twins, Ethel and Ella, John Brown, Ruth, shown sitting in the center of this photograph, wearing the plaid skirt. Note Fred, daughter Mar, and Austin in the background. And last, Norman. In 1922, the year that J.B. died, Fred made plans to leave Clarksville and purchased the farm at Curry's Corner in Windsor. The lumber market in the 1920s was very soft, and Eddie wanted her children to finish their grade school education in the county academy in Windsor. By 1925, the arrangements were complete. Austin agreed to move his portable mill over the bay. He and son Harold would log and saw lumber. Austin bought the store for his son Reg to operate. Fred, Eddie, and their 7 children moved to Curry's Corner in 1925. Fred purchased a general store, which he enlarged. He retained the firm's title, J.B. Campbell and Son. In 1928, Fred signed an agreement of sale with the Minas Basin Pulp Company for the sale of over 3,000 acres of woodlot, extending from Clarksville to Kennetcook, plus the idle stationary mill, for $15,000, to be paid on terms of $1,000 per year, plus interest. This quote from a letter of introduction written in 1936, on the eve of a trip to Cambridge, Massachusetts, describes Fred.
Besides being one of the leading businessmen of Windsor, he has at different times held prominent positions in the civic life: member of the town council, chairman of the school board, chairman of his church board, and clerk of the session.
Fred and Eddie's firstborn, Mar, married the Reverend Dr. Frank Archibald. They lived in many areas with their 2 children, including Stewiacke and Moncton, New Brunswick. Lillian, a pharmacist, married Dr. Duncan McMillan, who served a number of terms as member of the provincial legislature. They resided in Sheet Harbor until Duncan's death, raising 4 children. Ella, a registered nurse, married Major Percy Kennedy in England during the war. They resided in Truro, raising 2 children. Ethel, who earned her B.A. B.E.D. at Acadia, taught school and was a school principal in Halifax County until her retirement. Ethel still resides in the family home in Curry's Corner, as does her sister Ruth. Ruth also attended university to prepare for a teaching career. She taught at various Nova Scotian schools and then in Ottawa. John, after attending Acadia, returned to the family firm. Fred bequeathed the store to John and Norman, which they operated and expanded, still under the corporate title of J.B. Campbell and Son Limited, until 1979. John married Marjorie Curry. They have 5 children, and they presently reside in Peggy's Cove. Norman served overseas as pilot officer on bomber aircrew during the war. There he married Greta Frater. After the war, Norman joined John and his father in the family business. Greta passed away in February of this year. Norman still resides in Curry's Corner. There are 4 children. J.B. and Maggie's first daughter, Agnes Lenore Campbell, married Ormel Simpson of Economy on the 7th of August, 1894. Ormel was a sawyer and millwright. John Brown Campbell speaks on Ormel's skill as a sawyer.
Well, I would say it was the best in the country. I mean, I could get several people to say that, you know, people that, some of them, their parents told them about it.
Yeah.
But he was good, you know. I know they told me when the saw went back, you know, the carriage would go back, and he would stop and holler, just nick the end of the log practically. Oh, he was good. And that wasn't a modern mill. That was what they called a portable. And they'd take it back in the woods where they were cutting the logs and set it up.
Ormel, as millwright, was responsible for picking the mill site and setting up the mill equipment. As sawyer, he would determine which cuts would be taken from the log to maximize productivity and then saw to that plan. The Simpsons followed J.B. to Windsor, where Ormel built a house in 3 Mile Plains, a short walk from J.B.'s Pontic Road home. Agnes and Ormel had 6 children: William, Marguerite, Charles, Jean, Mildred, and Bernard. Shown in this photo are Bill and Marguerite. In this next shot, we see Jean sitting in white in the front, Marguerite behind Jean. Seated to their left is Charlie. Standing is cousin St. Clair Sterrett, and behind St. Clair, young Mildred. In this next shot, we see from left to right Jean, Mildred, and Bernard. And finally, cousin Helen Spur and Bernard. In 1910, the house in 3 Mile Plains on the outskirts of Windsor burned to the ground. The family sought temporary shelter for the winter in a large wood structure behind the double house on Stannis Street. In the following year, they boarded a 2-masted schooner and set sail for the North Shore to Carr's Brook. J.B. had purchased a partially completed home there for his daughter's family. Ormel completed the house. It was Aggie, with 6 children to care for, who volunteered to care for her ailing mother in 1913. Aggie's mother, Margaret Dickey Campbell, was living at her daughter's home at the time of her death in 1915. Aggie herself was not well. She was diagnosed as suffering from pernicious anemia. She died in March of 1925 at the age of 48. William, Bill Simpson, went west as a young man and only returned to Nova Scotia once much later in life. He gained employment with the wheat pool, supervising the construction of grain elevators in the West. In 1926, he married Jeanette Slater. They made their home in Regina. They had 1 child, Lenore. Marguerite, the second child, married Fraser Newton in 1918. Fraser was also a millwright and sawyer. When Austin moved to Clarksville in 1925, Fraser and Marguerite accompanied him. Fraser died as a result of injuries sustained in a mill accident in the early 1940s. Marguerite still lives in Windsor and has 4 children. Jean, after completing her nurse's training, married Walter Durning. They lived in Brampton, Ontario, and had 3 children. Shown is Walter Durning, Jean's husband, with Bill Simpson on the right. Charles, Charlie, joined the Navy in World War II, but was discharged at the request of the mining company which employed him. A mining engineer could better serve his community on dry land. He lived much of his life in Kimberley, British Columbia. He and his wife had 1 child. Mildred taught school in Clarksville in the early 1920s and remembers clearly teaching her cousins, Fred's children. Later, she trained as a nurse in Massachusetts with her cousin Ella, Fred's daughter. Mildred presently lives in the Annapolis Valley. Bernard was Aggie's youngest child. At age 14, he felt the call of the sea and signed up as a cookee on a vessel. He and his wife Yvonne had one child who was fatally injured in a car-pedestrian accident. Bernard died where he lived in the United States. J.B.'s sixth child was Janie. In 1896, she wed Oscar Sterrett. Oscar was, by 1907, a ship's captain, sailing under the flag of Bennett Smith, a major ship owner and shipbuilder in Windsor. In 1907, Oscar was the master of the Luarca, a large brigantine. Janie was, at this time, sailing with him, as indicated in correspondence of that year from Buenos Aires. In the next year, Janie moved west to Calgary, seeking relief from severe bronchitis. Oscar was at sea when she purchased their Calgary home. One unconfirmed source indicated that Oscar died shortly after retiring. It was stated that he died of pneumonia in 1914, leaving Janie with 3 teenage boys to raise. Their children were, from oldest to youngest, St. Clair, Jack, and Fred. St. Clair married and had one known child, Claire. Shown is St. Clair and his daughter Claire. Present research does not reveal whether or not Jack married. Fred married Annie. Based on Ella McNabb's photo album, it is indicated that they had 3 children, Helen, Margaret, and Gordon. This is merely an assumption not based on research. Fred worked for the CPR. J.B.'s 4th son, the Reverend Norman Garfield, chose a vocational path different from his older brothers. His health was at times frail, and he showed his father's devotion to religion. Norman enrolled in Dalhousie College in Halifax around 1903. In the summers, he kept records for the family lumbering business. In 1908, he followed his sister Janie's lead and departed for the more healthful climate in Calgary. For a time, he resided with Sister Janie. Norman completed his Bachelor of Divinity in Robertson Divinity College in Edmonton, where he became a member of the first graduating class in 1914. In the same year, he married Anne Lynn of Kilsyth, Ontario. Anne and Norman had 2 sons, Bernard, who died at 3 months, and Gordon, who died at 9 years, and 2 daughters, Allison and Jean. Norman held pastorates in a number of communities in Saskatchewan and Alberta throughout the 1920s and into the dirty 30s of the Prairie West, which must have tested the conviction of many men and provided a particular challenge for a man of the cloth. In May of 1937, due to terminal cancer, he brought his family back to Windsor to be near family members. Norman died in August of that same year. Allison married Walter Stevens in April of 1922. They honeymooned in the West, visiting Allison's aunt, Ella McNabb. The Stevens now reside in Windsor. They have 2 children. Jean married Bruce Morrison in June of 1961. They operated a farm in Windsor with their one son. Jean passed away in January of this year, 1989. The 7th child of J.B. and Maggie was Margaret Amelia. She married Reverend Ernest Bishop Spur. They had 2 daughters, Margaret Esmond Spur and Helen Campbell Spur. One of their daughters, Margaret Gilman, gives some information on her parents.
That I am related through their 7th child, their daughter, Margaret Amelia. Mother used to talk very happily about her early days within her family. younger half of the family, that's Uncle Norman and Uncle Fred and Aunt Ella and Mother, were made a natural grouping, and very often Uncle Bernard would be with them. And they used to love to sing together. They did a lot of singing together and living and playing together. Mother earned her own tuition for college. She decided that with all the boys in the family, that Grandpa Campbell had enough to do to pay for their way in college, so she decided to earn her own tuition. And she did this by teaching school. She started in, I believe, at the age of 16, and she was apparently had a big bully in her one-room schoolhouse that made life very difficult for her. But I think she must have been a very good and strict teacher. When she went to college and met my father, Ernest Bishop Spur, there was a question about religion, because he was going to be a clergyman in the Church of England, and as you all know, the Campbells were Presbyterian. However, Mother says that Grandpa, her father, said to her that if she was not going to be a Presbyterian, the next best thing would be to be a member of the Church of England. Mother was always very much a partner in the work in the church's work, and the two of them would go and make calls on people together. Well, Mother and Daddy it seemed as though they had two places where they lived for quite a long time. 10 years in Grace Bay and 16 years in Liverpool. But particularly after Daddy retired, they moved, and they moved according to where he had work. And so I think it's true that Mother made a home in 16 different houses. Mother developed diabetes as an older person, but she learned how to manage that, and she was bright and caring right up until the end.
Margaret, after attending Trinity College, Toronto, in her early 20s, went to China to teach English in a middle school for girls. It was in China that she met her future husband, Fred Gilman. They left China in 1937 and became residents of New Jersey. The Gilmans have 4 children. Helen Campbell Spur earned a degree in medicine, as did her husband, Davy Talk. They returned to his native province, Newfoundland, where her work in well baby clinics was so greatly appreciated that a school was named in recognition of her medical contribution. The Talks had 4 children. Dr. Helen Talk died of cancer at the age of 61. Ella Blanche Campbell was the youngest daughter and the 8th child born to J.B. and Margaret Dickey Campbell. Her diminutive size prompted one of her nephews to exclaim, "She's just a girlie." The name stuck in an affectionate way, so to the children she was known as Girlie. When living on Stannis Street, Ella met a handsome young Windsor Academy teacher, Charlie McNabb. They were married in December of 1906 in the Stannis Street home place. In 1910, Charlie was offered a position as the first manual arts teacher in Saskatoon. Charlie and his wife Ella and their 2-month baby, Jay Austin, set out for Saskatchewan. 2 more sons were born in Saskatoon: Norman Bishop McNabb and Charles Wellwood McNabb. In 1929, Charles was offered a position in Oxford, Cumberland County. The family moved home to Nova Scotia. J. Austin, their oldest son, remained in the West. In 1931, he was married by his uncle, Norman Garfield Campbell, to Peggy Coulter. They had 2 children, Jack and Marilyn. In 1932, the depth of the Depression, Austin returned for 3 years to Nova Scotia to cut pulp, returning to Saskatoon in 1935. After serving in the Air Force in World War II, he returned to Saskatoon and was employed as a city assessor until his retirement. Peggy died in 1978. His second wife is Mabel Sanderson. Norman has proved difficult to trace. He worked in Windsor in the late 20s and then returned to the West. Norman and his wife Betty had 2 children, Ronald Irving and David Frederick. Lieutenant Norman McNabb served in the Air Force in World War II. It is rumored that Norman is now living in British Columbia. Wellwood and his wife Frances were married in September 1940. They had 1 child, Gary. Wellwood rose to the rank of wing commander during the war and remained with the Air Force at war's end. He was later killed in a car accident. Charlie McNabb taught in 4 Cumberland County schools from 1929 until his retirement in 1943. Ella worked tirelessly for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, heading first the Oxford branch and then becoming the provincial president. So ends the pictorial history of 3 generations of Campbells. This video was prepared for the 1989 clan reunion at the family home of Will Campbell in Pembroke.